Historic Homes of Sauk County by Paul Wolter. Sponsored by the Sauk County Arts, Humanities, and Historic Preservation Committee. People sometimes ask what makes a house historic, and so we start with one of the humblest abodes in Sauk County with one of the simplest addresses, number 5 5th Street, Prairie du Sac, to prove that every house has a history. If we could turn back the hands of time, we would see that this humble structure was once the post office in Sauk City. It once sat on Water Street and was the post office from 1891 to 1911. It was then moved by Charles Stoddard, who hitched it to his new motor car and moved it to its present site. So, every house has a history, but this presentation will examine some of the historic houses of Sauk County to show the different styles that were popular from settlement times until about World War I. We will see how there were two main worlds of inspiration, the classical and the picturesque, and how the pendulum swung back and forth between them. The classical was the ancient world with its order, symmetry, and balance, and the picturesque encompassed other sources which promoted asymmetry, romanticism, and diversity. It's fitting that we start in Sauk City. If we go down to the bridge corner, we'll find a familiar building, which we'll come back to later, which sits on the site of one of Sauk County's first settler structures. In the summer of 1838, stagecoach driver Barry Haney hired 2 men to help him stake his claim to the land here by plowing up 10 acres and building a dugout-type shelter. The structure was about 12 by 16 feet and about 4 feet deep. It was covered with logs and buried with dirt. With settlement started, it wasn't long before pioneers began to fill Sauk County, and one of their primary needs upon arrival was shelter. Architecture was not foremost on the minds of most pioneers, however. A quick, cheap dwelling was usually what most pioneers built, with architecture coming later. Log dwellings were built from early settlement time in the late 1830s up until about the 1880s. Several examples of pioneer log homes can be found at the Reedsburg Pioneer Log Village. This cabin is the Johann and Anna Eitzman cabin, which was built about 1876. While most cabins have disappeared, a few still exist in the countryside, such as this one at Sky High Apple Orchard. It is the Johannes and Florentina Wiedenkopf cabin, built in 1863. The log cabin was a common sight around Sauk County for decades. Even when others were building high-style homes, the log cabin remained a staple of the pioneer lifestyle. After settlement in 1838, it wasn't too long, however, before sawmills and brickyards appeared, and people started thinking about style and not just utility. Some of the earliest styles to come to Sauk County, with settlers from the eastern United States, were remnants of colonial times. Let's call these early classical. If you're familiar with Sauk City history, then the name of Count Augustin Harasti should be familiar. As the founder of the settlement of Sauk City, which originally bore his name, the colorful Hungarian count began construction on what was going to be a grand estate between the two settlements of Prairie du Sac and what would become Sauk City. The house was started in the mid-1840s and was to be built of a revolutionary material, poured grout, much like the hexagon house in Milton, Wisconsin. The count left before the house was completed, however, and its next owner, John Wright, tore down the unfinished walls and built this house on the foundations. It was finished in 1851, with the brick being made in Madison. The house was designed by architect Walter Pashley in an early classical revival style that imitated what President Thomas Jefferson had been doing at Monticello and elsewhere, with an interest in Roman architecture. Here we have a typical temple front, with a half-round lunette in the gable, and protruding bricks acting as dentils. Walter Pashley also designed a house at the same time for early settler D.K. Noyes in Baraboo, which stood at the brow of the hill at Ash and Water Streets. This was a more substantial example of early classical revival, with a full temple front including 4 massive columns. This is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Noyes celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary in 1898. Unfortunately, the house was demolished in 1927. An even earlier example than the last 2 houses is the Harristy Bryant house built in Sauk City. The house was built near the bridge corner by the Count and his business partner Charles Bryant in the early 1840s. When Prairie du Sac and Sauk City were vying for the title of county seat, this structure was offered as Sauk City's contribution, with the building to be used as the courthouse. Prairie du Sac won the county seat with their offer of real estate, however, and the Harristy Bryant house was put to other purposes. In about 1915, the house was moved out to the edge of town and placed on Franklin Street. It's hard to tell exactly what style the house was in the 1840s, but its general massing and the single dormer on the roof give it kind of an Adamesque feel. The Adam style was a refinement of the Georgian style, once popular on the eastern seaboard, but already out of vogue. On the frontier, styles tended to lag quite a bit, with buildings constructed in styles that were already out of date in the east. For example, back at the bridge corner in Sauk City, we have a very curious Federal-style building. Although the building has had many additions, the 2-story portion still shows the Federal-style stepped gable. This structure was built in 1859 by Christian Obrecht as a residence and store building. The fact that a German immigrant would build a structure that was at least 30 years out of date shows us the great melting pot of America. This building gives us an architectural tie all the way back to the colonies. 2 other examples from Sauk City are not of any particular style, but show the vernacular or common forms of architecture from the early part of the county, including this example on Phillip Boulevard, and the Hahn House built in the 1840s, which is now a museum. The early classical styles of Sauk County, which look back to the early days of the Republic, would soon be replaced by the more popular Greek Revival. This style emerged in the first quarter of the 19th century as interest in classical buildings shifted from Roman examples to the mother of Rome, ancient Greece. This shift was influenced by archaeology of the time and the Greek War for Independence, which many U.S. citizens sympathized with. The democratic ideals of ancient Greece also seemed to fit the new republic, and the style became wildly popular in the U.S. Settlers from the east brought the style with them as they settled Sauk County. The Calvin Danforth home on the corner of Highway 12 and Highway C in the town of Sumter is the best remaining rural example of Greek Revival style in Sauk County. Danforth was a Vermonter who moved to the frontier and built this farmhouse about 1855. One may wonder what the difference is between the early classical styles, which we saw earlier, and the Greek Revival. Both are derived from classical antiquity, but the styles of Jefferson and Adams looked to ancient Rome for inspiration, whereas the Greek Revival focused on ancient Grecian examples such as the Parthenon. A replica of the Parthenon in Nashville, Tennessee, which was built for a World's Fair, shows us a Greek temple in all of its glory, with columns, cornice, frieze, and pediment. Please note that the columns have no bases but sit directly on the top step. Back at the Danforth home, we see the low-pitched temple front on the end of the building, with the columns reduced to fluted pilasters on the corners. In the frieze, we see tiny windows disguised with decorative wood grills. A Greek temple was not supposed to look too much like a 2-story building, so in order to get some windows for ventilation, they were hidden in the frieze. The front door of the Danforth home sits on the long side of the temple and originally had a small porch with 2 columns. If we look at the temple again, we will see that the main facade is really the short side, and therefore most Greek Revival homes will have the temple look on the front, such as the Cook home in Baraboo built in the late 1850s. Here we see the pedimented gable with continuous cornice across the front. In Prairie du Sac, the Moore House on 5th Street shows the temple front and something else very Greek, no bases on the columns. Next door is the home of Dr. Cummings, built in the 1850s, which was also built in the Greek Revival style. The Cummings house has the entry door on the long side, covered with a simple portico, but with a frieze copied straight from Greek temples. The Greek Revival style was also popular in rural Sauk County. One of the Waterbury homes on Old Bluff Trail, also known as Yankee Street for its predominantly eastern settlers, was built of native stone but adorned with a Greek Revival cornice. On this example, however, the cornice does not go all the way across the gable end, but rather stops short on either side. This is called a gable return. It was a way to save money and also allow for second-story windows. One of the finest Greek Revivals left, constructed of wood, is in Baraboo at the corner of Oak and 8th Streets. This late example shows the gable returns, which allowed for second-story windows. The entry vestibule and north side entrance were added later in the sympathetic Colonial Revival style. Nearby was another Greek Revival house. Because they are some of the oldest houses in Sauk County, they are fast disappearing, as we can see in this series of photos taken over the last several years. Virtually all traces of style have been erased, including the gable returns. Usually, though, one can still spot traces of an old Greek Revival, like this one in Prairie du Sac. This house was actually built in the lost settlement of Newport near Wisconsin Dells, and brought downriver after that community died. While the temple front Greek Revival was certainly the most common in Sauk County, it was not the only type. This example west of Baraboo has Greek Revival detailing with a hipped roof. The taller columns are replacements, but the small ones in the recessed porch have Ionic capitals, showing a later Greek style. This house in Baraboo on 4th Avenue is rumored to have come from Newport and shows an early classical form. The corners are decorated with pilasters. This house on East Street in Baraboo shows other high-style Greek elements. This original picture of the house shows a Greek key design in the frieze under the roof, which can still be seen today. Though the Greek Revival was the most popular style during the settlement of Sauk County, it was not the only style. If one preferred something less classical and more unique, there was the Gothic Revival. This movement was started as a revolt to the rigid classical forms and was popularized by books such as Andrew Jackson Downing's Cottage Residences, published in 1842. With the Gothic Revival, the plan of the house was allowed to grow from within, instead of trying to position rooms inside of a classical form, such as a temple. Emphasis on Gothic ornaments such as the pointed arch and vertical lines also made the style uniquely different. The House of Seven Gables in Baraboo is one of the finest examples of the Gothic Revival style in the state, but not the earliest example in Sauk County. Further to the north, in the settlement of Newport, Dawn Manor was built in 1855 by Abraham Vanderpoel, a wealthy lumber baron with a large family. The house was built out of local sandstone and decorated with Gothic Revival ornament. Although the Gothic Revival style looked back to English Gothic examples, it ultimately became its own style in America. One of the hallmarks of the style, particularly in this area where Carpenter Gothic was predominant, was the use of scroll-cut ornament, particularly along the eaves of the roof. Seven Gables in Baraboo was built in 1860 for banker Terrell Thomas and was adorned with scroll-cut ornament. Each major gable and porch has a different type of scroll-cut ornament, and the board and batten siding shows the emphasis of the Gothic Revival style on verticality. Side by side with a Greek Revival style house, this is about as opposite as one could get. The Gothic Revival style was popular in Sauk County from about 1855 to 1870, and Baraboo has the most homes of this style. In 1869, the A.G. Tuttle family built this house on their estate just northeast of the city. Here again we see the emphasis on verticality with finials and pointed windows. Also, the barge boards along the eaves show unique scroll-cut decoration. The estate also includes a Gothic Revival two-stall outhouse. Also in 1869, Henry Rich built this Gothic Revival house on the western outskirts of Baraboo. While the house has had some later Queen Anne alterations, much of the Gothic ornamentation remains. 2 years later, Swiss immigrant J.J. Gattaker had this home built in Baraboo, which still retains much of its somewhat more restrained Gothic ornament. Many times a house was designed using a combination of styles. This predominantly Italianate style home in Spring Green shows Gothic Revival ornament along the eaves. By the 1870s, the Gothic Revival style had long since passed out of favor in the eastern United States, but was still being used in the Midwest. The James Ashley House, built in 1873, is situated on Highway 12, just north of Baraboo, and shows a Gothic Revival farmhouse with an Italianate style bay window. Later in the 1870s, the style was somewhat reborn and was known as the High Victorian Gothic style. In 1878, Edward Hackett, a Reedsburg architect and builder, built his own home in this style. Here the scroll-cut ornamentation is more elaborate and more layered, but we still have the emphasis on verticality, especially with the finials at the peaks. Out in the countryside, the style lasted even longer. Between Baraboo and Rock Springs is this vernacular farmhouse, which is detailed with a Gothic Revival window. Above the window is a carved date stone showing that the house was built in 1881. A little farther to the east, we find another farmhouse with a Gothic-style window. Near Blackhawk are two farmhouses which still have high Victorian Gothic ornamentation. As Sauk County grew through the second half of the 19th century, another style began to emerge, this time with its roots in Italy. Already popular in the East as early as the 1840s, the Italianate style came later to Sauk County. The style was popularized by the books of Andrew Jackson Downing and others, as it looked back to rural Italian villas and farmhouses, again as a revolt against the formal classicism of earlier styles. As with all imported styles, though, it became its own uniquely American style. The Alonzo Waterbury House in Prairie du Sac was built in 1882 after Mr. Waterbury retired from farming on the Sauk Prairie. Like the Gothic Revival style, one of the hallmarks of the Italianate style is the use of scroll-cut ornament, but this time particularly for the creation of brackets to decorate the eaves and porches. Early versions of the style are not as lavishly decorated and show more emphasis on the Italian-inspired forms of the house. Around 1863, Melatiah Willis built this Italianate-style home in Prairie du Sac. The cupola, or belvedere on top of the house, was an interpretation of a tower found on rural Italian farmhouses. Here there are no scroll-cut decorative brackets, though, which is indicative of the early version of the style. Early styles were often updated through remodeling. The General A.W. Stark's house west of Rock Springs was built in the early 1850s, probably as a Greek revival, with the brackets at the roof added later to make the house more Italianate. In about 1865, this Italianate house was built complete with tower at the edge of Baraboo as a country estate. Here again is an early example of the Italianate style without scroll-cut ornamentation. Unfortunately, the house was split into two pieces in the early 1930s and made into two homes. Another early example of the Italianate style can be found in Reedsburg, here again with tower and no scroll-cut brackets. In Prairie du Sac, the home of attorney Samuel Kelsey, a Yankee from New York, was built in the 1860s and shows an early form of the scroll-cut bracket, each cut from one piece of wood. The Kelsey house was built of a local limestone called dolomite and is a wonderful example of the block and stack masonry technique that is found only in Sauk County and Dane County. This technique was used by 3 area masons and combined a veneer block with areas of stacked stone dressed up with tooled mortar joints. In 1870, on the northern outskirts of Prairie du Sac, Reverend John Tilkey had this house built along the Wisconsin River. Colored marble was used along with dolomite to enhance the facade of this Italianate style home. Nearby is the James Waterbury house, also built about 1870. The home shows Italianate brackets applied to a common house form, the gabled L. The gabled L was a common house form which could be decorated in nearly any style and can be found throughout Sauk County. It consists of a forward-facing gabled portion with side wing generally forming an L-shaped plan. Alonzo Waterbury built this limestone farmhouse on the Sauk Prairie before retiring to town. Here the gabled L is decorated with Italianate style brackets. In Reedsburg, this house on Park Street was built about 1876 and shows a vernacular form with Italianate detailing, particularly the arched windows, which became a major part of the style. In 1876, lumber baron Christian Obrecht built this stylish Italianate home in Sauk City. The home shows the most common Italianate shape, the 2-story cube. Along the eaves are some of the best scroll-cut brackets in Sauk County, paired with heavily ornamented arched windows with window hoods. Towers were an important part of the Italianate style, and in 1877, prominent Reedsburg businessman Henry C. Hunt had this house built fronting City Park and incorporating a tower. A few years later in Baraboo, Abram Walton had this home built with a spiral staircase inside the Italianate style tower. The 1880s were the peak of the Italianate style in Sauk County, and houses of this type can be found in nearly every large community, including the Oliver Knapp home in Prairie du Sac, which was built in 1880. This house was built in Baraboo in 1881 by woodworker and factory owner George Rule as a showcase of his work. The house originally had 115 scroll-cut brackets and a beautiful 2-story veranda on the back. The 1884 Myron Shirtliff home in Baraboo shows a later adaptation of the style with 2 sizes of decorative brackets under wide eaves. A few years later, Sim Mold, a Baraboo photographer, had this house built with unusual metal window hoods. The house was nearly lost forever before being restored by its current owner. Rural examples of the Italianate style are harder to find, but this house, a few miles south of Reedsburg, shows Italianate style arched windows and decorative brackets under the eaves. One of America's next emerging styles was the Second Empire, or French Second Empire style, which was named after the reign of Napoleon from 1852 to 1870. around the house. In 1891, wood contractor H.S. Carver built this home in Reedsburg with a wraparound porch and large keyhole window. The elaborately detailed bay window shows how the Queen Anne style used every surface for ornamentation. The 1894 August Killian house in Baraboo shows a small porch but with elaborate detailing. Also in Baraboo, the Walworth Porter double house is a rare Queen Anne style duplex. The Zarwell house in Prairie du Sac shows a Queen Anne style home with a tower borrowed from the Italianate style, although this time covered with patterned shingles. Towers were a popular feature of many Queen Anne homes and could be square, round, or octagonal, as seen here on the Carpenter house built in Baraboo and designed by a Madison architect. Another octagonal tower can be found on this home in North Freedom, which also includes patterned shingle work and scroll-cut ornament. A tower also appears on the Johnson home in Prairie du Sac, which was built in 1896. During the 1890s, the Queen Anne style started to become less ornate, and eventually even classical elements found their way into Queen Anne design. The 1898 H.L. Halstead home in Baraboo was designed by local architect Reuben McFarland, who incorporated classical columns into the design of the porch, along with classical oval and half-round windows on the side of the house. Formally trained architects were far more common in the late 19th century, and the mass production of pattern books also spread design trends like the Queen Anne style much more quickly. Michigan architect D.S. Hopkins distributed plan books from which clients could order working drawings to be given to a local builder. The 1898 Ulrich von Wald house in Baraboo was built from this Hopkins design, with the builder faithfully recreating every element shown in the drawings. Due to its popularity, every community in Sauk County had a Queen Anne house or a vernacular home with Queen Anne details. The John Thompson home in Merrimack and this simple home in Ironton show the vernacular Queen Anne. Some of the largest homes ever built in Sauk County were designed in the Queen Anne style. In Reedsburg, prominent businessman and civic leader William Stolte had this 3.5-story Queen Anne style home built Side of the house, however, the design shows an irregular layout. Sometimes it is hard to say a house is one style or another. This house in Spring Green has columns and a Palladian window from the Colonial style, but the asymmetry and diversity of the Queen Anne. Nearby, the Flynn home has more of the symmetry of the Colonial Revival style, but with flanking Queen Anne bay windows. The D.A. Lewis house in Baraboo, built in 1902, has a symmetrical second floor and attic, with a Queen Anne porch curving around a truncated one-story tower base. Later examples of the Colonial Revival style were more faithful to their colonial predecessors. The Edmund Hebing house in Reedsburg, built about 1925, shows a far more detailed attempt at an Adam-style house, as does the Presbyterian manse in Reedsburg. In Baraboo, the Langer House was built in the early 1930s and designed by Madison architect Frank Riley. It shows an adaptation of a Georgian-style house from the colonial era. A subset of the Colonial Revival style is the Dutch Colonial Revival, which used the gambrel roof associated with Dutch settlements in the colonies. These houses were rarely faithful copies of their predecessors, but are identified by their distinctive roof. In 1896, attorney Herman Groteforst had one of the first houses in Sauk County built in the Dutch colonial style in Baraboo. In Reedsburg, blacksmith John Kelly had this Dutch colonial home built about 1906. Contractor Herbert Judevine built this home for himself in Baraboo in 1908 in the Dutch colonial style. While most early examples had the front entrance on the gable end, later versions, such as the home of Harry Sorg in Reedsburg, built in 1924, had the entrance on the side. Once again, this was closer to the original Dutch colonial homes. Interest in classical forms was also heightened by the buildings at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Cousins to the Colonial Revival, neoclassical homes were built by wealthy clients such as Reedsburg banker Ralph Perry, who had this home constructed in Reedsburg in about 1908. Around the turn of the 20th century, another type of house became popular in Sauk County, especially for the more economically minded. The American Foursquare home is more about a form than a style. The form consisted of a two-story plan, generally cube-like, which could be decorated with just about any style or made from any material. This example in Bear Creek Township shows a Foursquare home built out of cast concrete block, which became popular around 1900. Often, a homeowner or farmer could make their own blocks out of concrete, as Christian Gruber did for his house in 1912 north of Prairie du Sac. This economical and long-lasting building material was even used for the porch foundation and columns. The house also has a roof covered in metal shingles. A mason, such as Chris Fuchs of Sauk City, could also be hired to build your house. Fuchs used his own Foursquare home in his advertisements. Different types of concrete blocks could be used to make a house unique. Chris Fuchs built the ultimate cement block house in 1911 for Julius and Lizette Burroughs in Sauk City. The house has a parapet with battlements to look like a castle. A Foursquare home could have any style applied to it for decoration, like this Prairie Craftsman example in Baraboo, or this more colonial version in Reedsburg. During the first quarter of the 20th century, the Craftsman Style began to emerge in Sauk County. The style began as the arts and crafts movement in England as opposition to the Industrial Revolution and its mass-produced culture. The style extolled hand craftsmanship and quality in art and furniture, and eventually influenced home design. In America, the style became popular for smaller houses and eventually spawned the bungalow. The 1910 William Schultz house in Baraboo is an early example of the arts and crafts aesthetic. The two-story bay window, stucco exterior, and diamond-paned casement windows were influenced by English design. The Sauk City home of Ernie and Ida Kirschner was built in 1912 and shows the emerging Craftsman style, blended with Queen Anne elements and even classical details such as the dentils on the front.